Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Keith, and it's Sunday, so that means we are talking about Hyperion. Well, the second book in the Hyperion series, the Fall of Hyperion. We are about, 15 chapters in now? This is part 3. I don't even know if we're halfway through the book yet. I just hit part 2 in the book according to the book. So, yeah, there's a lot. But I feel like I say that every week that we talk about this particular book. So I guess we'll just get straight to it as far as the discussion is concerned. So chapters 11 through 15 are a lot of Severin and Gladstone and not a lot of the pilgrimage, which is so frustrating. I think it's really interesting that this second book, the first book is like completely about the pilgrimage, and so you get super invested in all of these characters, and then he proceeds to spend the next, most of this book so far not talking about them. We were getting like every odd chapter or like every other chapter was the pilgrimage, but that kind of like dwindled off, I guess, for lack of another word. Now we're in a place, or now we're getting, 2 and 3 chapters of Gladstone and maybe 1 chapter of the pilgrimage. So chapters 11 through 15, we only got 1 pilgrimage chapter. The other 4 chapters are all a bunch of like political subterfuge and commentary on like the politics of the entire thing. Kind of like a lot of time is being spent on world building in a way that the first book didn't do. I think part of the second book is to really establish the stakes of the pilgrimage, because in the first book we don't really know exactly why the pilgrimage is so important. It's kind of like ambiguously told to us why it's so important, but they're not really clear. When we hear about the Techno Corps in the first book, we do find out like a little bit about them that kind of indicates to us that they are heavily invested in Hyperion, but as to why their heavy investment into Hyperion has anything to do with everybody else in the galaxy's investment into Hyperion, we are not totally sure. So that is, I don't know if I'd say more than a little frustrating, but actually I wouldn't even call it frustrating at all. I think that's just good writing. A lot of what's good about these books is that Simmons always kind of leaves you wanting for more. He'll give you just like a little nugget or like a carrot right in front of you, and you're like, oh, I'll just read one more chapter, or I'll just listen to one more chapter, and then he'll finally explain this thing that I really want to know. And he ultimately just doesn't for another like 4 chapters, especially in this book. Because at the end of chapter 10, we finally had some action with the pilgrimage where Hoyt had died and everyone's freaking out, and so they decide to go into the time tombs with the Sphinx, and then Kassad sees something and he's using people as bait so that he can attract whatever that something is, and it's just really, I guess, interesting, for lack of another word. It's finally getting interesting. They're not just like bickering amongst themselves, which was kind of frustrating because it felt like for a little while there it was just like, okay guys, can you stop acting like children and just start like getting this thing done? You spent the entire first book getting to the time tombs, and now we're here and you're doing nothing, which is lame. So chapter 11 opens up with us on Severin, who is kind of like in this weird spot as far as his own personal development is concerned. He's kind of realized that he is really just like a tool for Gladstone. I don't know why I forgot her name for a second there, but he's kind of just realizing now that he's just generally a reconnaissance tool for Gladstone, and that she doesn't really have like a vested interest in him as an individual so much she doesn't as him in a resource. And part of him as a resource is the fact that he's connected to Braun Lamia through the original John Keats persona, or at least one of the original John Keats personas. And so because of that connection, we are able to, hear his take on different aspects of the pilgrimage. And so is Gladstone, who would otherwise not know what was going on. So he ends up getting to go down to the surface of Hyperion, and we find out that the hegemony never had any intent of evacuating anyone from the planet of Hyperion, because they never believed that they would actually, or the ousters would ever actually get there, because the reconnaissance on the ouster ships, and we find this out later on in these 5 chapters, indicated to them that the ouster force would not be sufficient to break through the forces that they had amassed in the Hyperion system itself. And so there was really never any worry of any kind of like planet-side warfare, but it's not looking so hot for the hegemony right now. One aspect of this book that has kind of been brought up a few times is that this war is an inevitability, and part of the inevitability of that war is that it ultimately leads to the demise of the human race, according to all predictions. But the problem is that even with those predictions, there is a factor in there that cannot be accounted for because it exists outside of time. And that is, of course, the Shrike and the Time Tombs. So in all of the techno-cores, speculation and hypothesizing, they cannot account for the Shrike. They cannot account for Hyperion and its influence in the overall result of this war, or in the overall result of like what the next highest form of being is going to be. Because the Technocore seems to be trying to make themselves into that highest form of being by becoming creators. As we learned in the last book, there's like this secret operation going on where they're trying to make an exact replica of Earth, and that's part of the reason that they've been making the cybrids with John Keats' personality in them. The other part, or the reason they've been using Keats, is because he wrote the original Hyperion cantos. So there seems to be some sort of like connection, they think. And I had to guess there's going to be some sort of like, I don't know, reincarnation type thing, or like some sort of existing outside of time. And John Keats is an individual who's able to achieve that transcendence in some way. So that's how he ends up writing about a place that he's never been, or a thing that he's never seen. Or ultimately that human beings have been God all along, and so everything that they've written into existence has become existent. And there is some indication of that being a potential theme in the book, because Martin Silenus believes in some capacity that he summoned or created the Shrike in some weird way. So we're going to keep talking about these 5 chapters, and that'll be right after this quick commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Talking about Hyperion, the fall of Hyperion, that is, chapters 11 through 15. So I just kind of finished talking about, some of the main themes that I was kind of predicting for the rest of the book, as to like how not necessarily the series would end, but just like some themes that seem to be kind of like reoccurring, and might be foreshadowing in some capacity. The idea of creating a god seems to be pretty prevalent in this particular novel, especially in this book or this entry in the series, because they're talking a lot about what it is that the Technocore is doing as far as what their next steps are concerned. There seems to be a lot of like jostling back and forth of information and secrets that individuals are keeping for their own benefit and not for the benefit of everybody. There seems to be a lot of like kind of conniving antics happening, if you will. The Technocore doesn't really want to admit to or reveal that they are in fact building an exact replica of Earth to the hegemony. And the hegemony doesn't really want to reveal that they know that the Technocore is lying. And then the Technocore is the group that gave the reconnaissance they gave partial reconnaissance to the hegemony in regards to the ouster invasion of Hyperion. I think that part of the thing with Hyperion and the Technocore working with the hegemony on it is that the Technocore isn't necessarily invested in the success or the failure of the hegemony in this particular regard, because it doesn't really make sense to them to really care. Because, like, either way, they're going to kind of end up where they want to be, I guess would be where I'm kind of going with that, or this, rather. Because regardless of whether or not the humans win or the ousters win, their unresolved factor will be resolved, because Hyperion will have done something. And so that something will give them the ability to continue to make predictions about what it is that's going on in the universe, where they're going to fall in that order of things. I think that the Technocore kind of represents, in some weird capacity, something similar to what the Pecora in the first book represent, where it's like, this is what happens when you have knowledge of the future, when you have knowledge of the outcome of things, then you have a tendency to act in a way that is like decidedly different from everybody else. And I'm not exactly sure, like, I haven't really talked about what about this book is, like, the alien part, the new knowledge part that makes it, like, decidedly science fiction. Because a big thing about this book is that it treads this fine line of really almost feeling like a fiction or fantasy. Sorry, not, of course it's fiction. It treads this fine line of feeling like a fantasy novel that just happens to be in a science fiction world, kind of like what Dune does. It doesn't exactly have that, like, alienus novum or novum alienus or novus alienus. I can't remember right now exactly what the phrase was. I think it's nova alienus. Anyway, new alien. I apologize, everybody. But it doesn't really have that in a very decided way. I kind of mentioned it in regards to the ending of the first book with the pilgrims and how they all have this specific type of knowledge about, like, the world around them or the universe or the Shrike in itself, and that's what made them alien. But as far as this book is concerned, it seems like the only alien person, the only person with that unknown or with that that knowledge, that new knowledge, is Severin, the guy who's the second iteration of Keats. And that's just because he's connected to the pilgrims. And then the pilgrims all seem to kind of have, like, their own motivations in every interaction that they have with everybody. Like Cassad telling Saul Weintraub and Lamia to go into the time tombs is, you know, his attempt at getting them to like attract the Shrike so that he can kill the Shrike and kill Moretta, I think is her name. I can never remember her name correctly. I apologize. But the one chapter that we did get on the pilgrimage is actually about General Cassad. It would make sense if he were to die next, because the first person that's died so far is Duray. And Duray was also the first person to tell his tale in the first book. So if Cassad dies, which it's seeming like he might do that, based on the end of the chapter, or end of his chapter, then that'd be an interesting parallel for us to see. He is engaged in some sort of combat with something that seems to have, like, the same weaponry as him. It's not the Shrike. It's someone with a rifle. It's someone with lasers. It's someone with weaponry that is similar to the weaponry that he's using. His whole chapter is actually very similar to the chapter that he has in the first Hyperion book, where it's very combat heavy, very action heavy, and, like, there's just, like, brief mention of a backstory. Simmons gives us, like, re-summarizes why it is that Cassad is fighting and who he's looking for by retelling us about, like, the encounters that Cassad has had with Moretta. And that is helpful in some capacity, but I don't necessarily think it was necessary. Wow, that's a sentence. Great job, Keith. Thumbs up. I apologize. But we don't know exactly who it is that Cassad is fighting, but they are appearing in his sensors on his combat suit, which implies that it is some sort of being that is different from the Shrike, because it doesn't seem like the Shrike registers as a living being on any sensors, because it's been impossible for anyone to track it and its whereabouts. And it doesn't really leave any evidence when it kills people. So to me, the Shrike seems like kind of like a virus. Like it feels like it ought to be a living biological organism, but as far as the definition of what makes something a living organism, it doesn't quite meet all of the requirements. So I think that that is part of Simmons' intent, is for us to be kind of like in that weird spot of, like, it exists in and out of time, in and out of life, in and out of perception. So, and in and out of reality, really, because it hasn't really been confirmed that the thing is actually real by anyone other than the people on the pilgrimage who've interacted with it in some capacity, and not even everybody on the pilgrimage has interacted with it in some capacity. Even Rachel Weintraub, whose first birthday is like literally 3 days away. So I guess the thought is that she'll stop existing in 3 days, though I wouldn't be surprised if she continues to age as if she was in the womb. And that's ultimately what kills her, quote unquote. Also wouldn't be surprised if somehow the sickness makes her immortal, and so the cells are alive in some capacity all the way until they just kind of poof out of existence. Or reverse aging. Anyway, we'll talk more about that right after this next quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Yeah, so right before the break, was just talking about Kassad's chapter in Hyperion and kind of the importance of it in regards to these 5 chapters that we're talking about. Obviously every chapter in here is important. I don't think any of them are really throwaway chapters. That's one of the really interesting things about this book in particular, is that it doesn't really seem like any detail is irrelevant, which is really cool, but also very what's what I'm looking for? I guess cumbersome would be the right word. Not because it's not obnoxious. It just feels like everything is kind of like a Chekhov's gun, or we're going to get back to that. And that is something that I've definitely noticed over the course of this book, especially the second one, is that everything that was set up in the first book is kind of coming to fruition in the second book. Everything that's set up in the first book is coming to fruition in the second book. Because the Severin keeps on running into individuals who were involved with the Pilgrims, which is super interesting, because we kind of get this weird, how do you know that I know this person that knows this thing that's on the pilgrimage that I know about it's on the pilgrimage, but not everybody's supposed to know about the fact that they're on the pilgrimage, type interactions, which I just find to be really cool, I guess, for lack of another word. Because it is just generally interesting. It's just not something that you normally see in books. So one of the people that Severin runs into in this particular set of chapters, actually he runs into 3 important people. He runs into the woman who was the editor for Silenus. So she is actually the one who Silenus quit in front of. And she was really upset with him, and she's the one who published his Cantos, which apparently she mentions are being reconsidered for publication by a different company, which is interesting because ultimately It's been made pretty clear that Silenus is kind of like washed up and doesn't really, like, nobody really gives a crud about him anymore. He did well for himself when he was writing the Dead Earth novels, but they ultimately kind of like he brought them to a close and like didn't really do anything with them because they were really useless and crappy by the time that he got done with them, because they were just basically, he was just a foil for the editors to kind of like tell him, this is what you're going to write, and this is how it's going to go, and if you don't like it, then that sucks. You're stuck in a contract. You're going to write this so that we can make money off of it. And so that's what he did. And ultimately, it was really unsatisfying, and that's part of why he quit. But the company that is looking to publish his stuff is going to publish the Cantos, which is odd because the Cantos didn't sell at all, and only Sad King Billy bought like, I think 90% of the copies. There's like, he bought like 8,000 copies out of all the copies that were sold. So it was a pretty big deal. But it's neither here nor there. So we meet the editor, or Severin meets the editor, who seems to have like some sort of like social influence that is relatively important in some capacity. And so that is interesting to explore. And then the more important one that we get a little bit more interaction with that kind of gives us an indication that we might get some more like new characters introduced into the story is we actually get introduced to Emilio, the doctor who was the love interest for Rachel Weintraub before she started aging in reverse. And he interacts with Severin planetside. Severin tells him about his like, well, he doesn't really tell him about his connection to he does tell him about the connection to the pilgrimage. Doesn't give a ton of detail, but basically just says that Rachel's still alive, she's on Hyperion, and that it's kind of baloney that the pilgrims are allowed to record data, but like the researchers aren't. And he actually ends up taking this to Gladstone and says, like, look, you could have saved Father Hoyt if you hadn't prevented the consul's ship from flying out to them. And she doesn't, I don't know, it seems more and more like Gladstone is just like super, super calculated with everything that she does. Kind of like a politician in the Galactic Empire. I am suspicious of her allegiances of like to humanity as a whole, and I'm suspicious of her origins, just because it seems like she's almost too good to be true. Almost any time you get someone who kind of comes off as like, or is portrayed as like this quasi-benevolent dictator, you should be pretty nervous about what it is that they have to offer. And she's been in power as the leader of the hegemony for like longer than anybody else ever has. And so there's definitely mention by Severin that that's weird, because ultimately it really is weird when individuals are able to maintain that type of power for a long period of time, especially since, you know, it's the entire galaxy, the entire race of humans spread out over hundreds and hundreds of worlds. And so it seems a little interesting that Severin is interacting with her. And Severin seems to be kind of like rubbing elbows with a lot of very important players. He finds out when he's talking to the gentleman who met the pilgrims at the very beginning of their pilgrimage, the governor of Hyperion, that is when he finds out that ultimately there was never any intention for there to be an evacuation. And this also angers him. It seems like he's the only person who's really invested in the well-being of individuals in this particular book. It seems like Gladstone and all the other senators and all the people who are interacting with each other in regards to making decisions are kind of looking at things in like a more grand scheme, where like Gladstone is indicating that she feels that every interaction that the pilgrims have potentially with the Shrike has like galaxy-wide implications as far as what happens to the human race is concerned. And so she's not concerned with Father Hoyt or with Rachel Weintraub or with anybody, even though she knows all of their stories, she's not concerned with them as individuals because she's concerned with the whole picture. And it seems there's kind of like a juxtaposition as to which one of those things is going to hold more like power and sway overall. So, we are going to kind of move on to a different portion. There's a specific scene that I want to talk about that happens within these 5 chapters, and that'll be right after this quick commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
I was kind of talking about the differences that we were seeing between the ways in which Gladstone was handling the pilgrimage and the ways in which Severin was or is handling the pilgrimage. We are reading a book, so I think it's is. I don't know. I was just an English major in college. What do I know? So there is a specific scene, however, that kind of gets at a philosophic idea that we've talked about on here before. So the Technocore is supposedly making an exact replica of Earth. Now, as to why they're doing this, I am unsure. If I had to guess, I am thinking that the Technocore is trying to prove that God does or does not exist in some capacity. I get the vibe from Simmons that he is not necessarily a Christian, but he is like a theist of some sort. So I am just kind of inclined to think that, the first book had a lot to do with like the innate nature of man. And that innate nature, according to Simmons' conclusion, is to consume and destroy. We talked about in the last tale, the Consul's Tale, that ultimately what happens is that on every planet mankind goes to, they kill whatever semi-sentient beings are there and claim that they had no sentience, claim that they were just animals. And human beings even do that to each other. They'll kill other human beings and then try to justify it by dehumanizing them. Just look at any mass genocide, look at things that happen on a regular basis in our own country. There's this constant idea of othering. And I think that Simmons was trying to get at that as a part of like the pernicious and evil aspect of humanity that is intrinsic to everything that we do. So in his portrayal of that, we kind of learn what he thinks about, what's intrinsic about humankind. But I think that the second book is going to be more about what's intrinsic in regards to God. Like, what are the properties of a God? And it seems like they're kind of toying with this in some capacity because the Shrike represents like some aspect of God in that he doesn't interact with reality in a temporal fashion. He is extra-temporal, as in like outside of time. So the fact that the Shrike kind of represents part of that, and we are getting closer and closer to actually probably seeing the Pilgrims interact with the Shrike, to me indicates that that's what this book is partially about. But what really indicates it to me is that the Technocore, when they start talking about having made a perfect replica of Earth, the CEO Gladstone is very quick to say, like, well, if you make a new Earth, doesn't that kind of make you like God in some capacity? And it doesn't seem that the Technocore thinks that because they make a new Earth, they would be God. But there is an indication that part of them making this new exact replica of Earth is to make their own God. And I think that that's been a big theme kind of like in this book, is whether or not, and in the last book too, to a degree, whether or not it is that human beings become human and gain some sort of like something extra by creating a god, or if God creates them and then human beings supposedly usurp God. And that's been something that has been mentioned several times throughout the book, is this idea of sentient life usurping its gods and surpassing them in a way that is like meaningful and concrete. And I think that that's kind of because the Technocore seems to be driven towards evolution in some capacity, which doesn't really make sense as to why they would call it that, because evolution is like strictly a word normally associated with biology, and the Technocore exists in like this kind of like abstract electronic data fashion, though ultimately like that's not really all that different than how our own brains work, and it is called artificial intelligence. Intelligence is based off of electrical signals that occur within the brain that create thought. So in some capacity, the Technocore really isn't all that different, if not completely the same, as any other sentient to semi-sentient life. I mean, like, or even non-sentient life. If it has like a brain like a brain in any regard, then it does have thought or intelligence of some sort. So I think that part of Simmons' point is that like things with intelligence create gods because they look to explain things that are unexplainable. And the fact that Hyperion is unexplainable, it's the only unexplainable phenomena in the galaxy to the Technocore, might be one of the reasons why why it's so important to them. And I'm just going to say in advance, if I accidentally talked myself into into the conclusion of any part of this book, I just want to say I have not read ahead. I am only on chapter 15 at this point. So if this is something that happens later on in this book, I'm going to be thrilled that I just accidentally talked my way into it. But that does make sense to me as far as like what Simmons' point might be, is that when a creature or an organism develops intelligence, it inquires about the makeup of things and how they work. And when it runs into something that is inexplicable, then it tries to find a way in which to explain it. And oftentimes, because of the limitations of understanding within that organism at that time, it just is, oh, well, the gods did it. Or the special being up in the sky did it. This special being that like sees everything you do and wants you to be a good person and wants to like give you things and like give you eternal life, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I think that that is just like an interesting aspect of what it means to be human, but also sentient. And so like the artificial intelligences of the Technocore are readily acknowledged as being at least somewhat sentient by the hegemony. But I think that to them, there's still inexplicable factors within the universe, and some of those inexplicable factors that they want to explain are like, why is it that mankind became mankind? Why is it that they've dominated the galaxy? What happens after they're gone? Will they ever be gone? What happens to us? What is our next step? Are they our creators? Are they the Technocore's creators because they made the original artificial intelligences? There's a lot of questions that I think are unanswered by the Technocore, and so instead of like constructing a god that's spiritual, they're constructing a god that's physical because it's the opposite of what they are, whereas humans constructed a god that was kind of like just objectively just comprised of data. So anyway, I'll talk more about that in a second. We'll be right back after a quick commercial break.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Right before the break, I was kind of talking about this idea that Simmons is going to kind of focus this second book in the series mainly on what it is that constitutes God and what it is that constitutes like evolution or advancement. To me, the fact that he uses Keats as like a primary example or as a primary figure in the work kind of says that he values the like in-between period between like kind of like romanticism and modernism, like because Keats kind of has a little bit of both, in my opinion, as far as the work of his that I've read, and the time period in which he falls in is kind of this ambiguous period where we're starting to get like some of the modern affectations of poetry that we're more familiar with, but we're also still kind of holding on to the vestiges of the poetry of the past. And Keats kind of is he's like kind of like the, what is that? Not Debussy, but there's another Chopin, I think it is. Chopin. There's a couple of music composers that are around a similar time period that also happen to fall like in between these weird spots in the timeline overall or the chronology of music genres. So I think that that's kind of part of why Keats is such an important figure, because of his association with like romanticism. Because in romanticism, there's this idea of like organic, flourishing language that ultimately kind of helps you to reach enlightenment in a certain capacity. I had a different direction that I was going with this, but then I couldn't remember it. But maybe it'll come back to me in the middle of talking about something else. But regardless, obviously it's important that Keats has ties across like different kind of like time periods, I guess, for lack of another word. So we are, I'm mentioning Simmons. I mentioned earlier that Simmons is kind of portraying the Technocore as being like curious in some capacity. I think that Simmons is absolutely trying to tell us in some way that the Technocore is kind of, I guess, attempting to prove itself would be the way that I would phrase it. I'm getting this like very much I would call it a vibe, I guess. That's just a word the kids are using these days. I'm getting this vibe from the way that the Technocore interacts with the humans, that the Technocore does not like the fact that in some capacity their origination is associated with human hands and human intelligence, because ultimately I think the Technocore believes themselves to have reached some higher form of being. And right before the break I had mentioned that like God is objectively data, and that's because God in some capacity, just like objectively, we cannot prove that it exists. It is simply this unconcrete thing that makes things concrete. So it is of nothing, and we are of everything because we're from that of nothing. And the Technocore seems to kind of like interact with its God every day in some weird way, because the Technocore was created essentially by human hands. The Technocore are evolved robots, and they call themselves evolved, but I believe that part of their pursuit is to like be able to create man from nothing, the same way that man created them from what they would perceive as being nothing. Because in some capacity, like if you think about the creation narrative of most any religion, the materials from which reality that we know it are spun are completely unfamiliar to us because they exist in a capacity that we don't understand. And I would argue that the Technocore would also, in some capacity, find that same thing to be true, because it's kind of like, how do you get the idea of like where does the idea to even create something like that come from? I think is the foreign concept. What would be the foreign concept to machines in the Technocore is, it's not so much that the materials are questionable. Like, we understand atoms, and that's, if God exists, that's what we're made of, is like atoms, molecules, all that jazz. And then probably something even smaller than that, and then something even smaller than that. But that's quantum theory, and like maybe we'll talk about it someday. But the thing that the Technocore experiences is that like they don't have cellular life. They're made up of electronic signals. And so the thing, like the idea of cellular life creating them would be equally foreign to them as the idea of us being created from nothing. Because it's just a way of being that's intrinsically separated from the way of being that you are familiar with. And that's why cybrids are kind of like a weird thing, because if the Technocore is thinking like, well, we need to prove that we can make man the same way that they made us, then ultimately the cybrids are kind of like the first step in that, because the cybrids are basically just biological form that is endowed with a Technocore consciousness that is created from like digital data, or from data taken from genetic material that ultimately like helps them to dictate, genetic material and history and accounts of this individual, so that they can ultimately like create, quote unquote, a person. And I think that is part of why Severin and like all of the other cybrids go mad, is because like in some capacity they are two different alternative forms of existence that are smushed together or forced to be together, even though they shouldn't necessarily be. And so I think that part of the theme of the novel is this idea of like the Technocore in some way represents human beings, because in some way human beings have been doing the same thing that the Technocore is doing, and that is like trying to prove that we have control over something around us. We, in the book they terraform planets, they take over planets, they use the resources from those planets to create other things. They expand further and further into the universe in this sort of like sick, manipulative form of manifest destiny that they justify by saying like, oh, well, we need these resources in order to continue doing it is what we're doing. But what it is that they're doing is fueled by this like intrinsic desire to surpass God, quote unquote. And so that seems to me to be exactly what it is that the Technocore is doing. They are going and doing all these things, hurting individuals, causing strife within the hegemony itself by providing incomplete reconnaissance information and all sorts of other factors that are contributing to the overall dysfunction and difficulty of the war, which is really kind of like fueling the Technocore's ability to like understand themselves more in some capacity because they're evolving at a specific rate. So we're going to take our last quick commercial break, and then we'll finish up our discussion on chapters 11 through 15.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
So right before the break, I was kind of touching on some of the, I guess, larger themes that I think might be kind of at work with this particular novel. I was talking specifically about this idea of like what is being defined as evolution. That seems to be something that's kind of been debated back and forth by both the Technocore and by Gladstone and the rest of her team. So or the rest of her entourage, I guess would be the or what I'm looking for. And there is this one specific scene that I would like to touch on real quick or after I finish the thing on evolution. So I think that the Technocore is they're like actively seeking to evolve to the next level. And so I think they're trying to that means to them like understanding something that they don't understand. And so in going through that process of attempting to understand that, which it is they don't understand, they're creating gods, but their gods are going to be in the opposite form of their existence in the same way that our gods were in the opposite form of our existence. And that the interactions will look different than how they look to us. So I also wouldn't be surprised to see the return of the hacker that Lamia used to help turn the original Keats into a human being before, well, at least more human than he was previously, because he still was kind of like beyond human. Regardless, there's this scene towards the end of chapter 15 where Gladstone and Severin are in this war council meeting, and they're all kind of talking about, how are we going to handle the Ouster invasion? They've killed way more people than we thought they would, which is like 4,000, but 4,000 amongst like 1 billion, 4 billion doesn't even it seems like a negligible amount. So I'm really surprised that there seems to be so much stress and anxiety over such a small, not that 4,000 people dying is not a big deal, but just in like the grand scheme of this book and the grand scheme of humanity in this book, it just doesn't seem like that many people for them to be worried about. But Gladstone seems to be worried about every single individual's life, except for the lives of the people who are on the pilgrimage. Regardless, because of this, she's kind of worried now about the war. And there's this kind of discussion that, like, war is going to have to become an art form in the same way that, like, every other disgusting human habit has become an art form. And, like, someone even says that going to the bathroom is going to eventually become an art form because of the way that humanity evolves and grows over time. And so they're talking about war needing to become an art form. And Gladstone's kind of like counteracting that with, well, there's like this cost of human life. And that is kind of like a short debate. But Gladstone asks for advice from a gentleman who is like a war hero from Maui Covenant. And we don't exactly know, like, in what capacity it is that he is a hero. We don't know if he helped to, like, finalize the invasion through some sort of courageous act, if he did this or did that. But it's an interesting interaction because ultimately no one in the military is happy with the advice that he gives Gladstone, and she doesn't even end up following it. But if I had to guess, it seems to me that honestly, Gladstone wants to lose in some capacity. It doesn't seem to me like she has a vested interest in humanity winning this war for Hyperion against the Ousters. It seems like a lot of what's going on is just political jostling amongst all these individuals. And that is kind of like hinted at by Severin in some capacity. And it's definitely hinted at by the officer who gives her the advice, because he explicitly says, like, I don't understand all the intricacies of, like, war and politics. I'm just giving you a strictly tactical, what would a tactician in a military role do in this situation? Now, what they're talking about is moving more ships to Hyperion, because Hyperion represents such a valuable asset to multiple individuals, but the reconnaissance on the Ouster fleet was poor, so they've lost way more ships and way more people than they ever thought they would. And the general who's in charge of it is now realizing, like, holy cow, we are kind of screwed, and basically asks for about 90% of the military force of the hegemony to be taken to the Hyperion system to aid in the fight. And that just seems kind of like it's a huge ask. It's a really big ask because it depletes all of the hegemony's military resources from every other location that might be important. And so if I had to guess, because Gladstone ultimately decides that that's what she's going to do, there's a pretty big potential that when everything starts to go south, that it won't be the Ousters or the Shrike that ultimately destroys humanity, but it will be humanity itself that destroys itself. And I wouldn't be surprised to see that be like one of Simmons' potential conclusions. I'm not entirely sure. I do think that there is some sort of like profound metaphor that's happening through like the depiction of Rachel Weintraub aging backwards, that at some certain point in civilization you reach this tipping point where you are either going to continue, or you're going to start rolling. Well, you reach the top of the hill, I guess would be the way to phrase it. And then you can stay on top of that hill for a long time, but at some point you're going to roll down. It's almost inevitable. And so when you roll down, it's kind of like a going backwards in some way. But that's also like a cycle of life. Because you start out as a baby and then you become very like physically adept and you stay there for hopefully until you're like 40 or 50 and you're still pretty physically adept. And then as you get closer and closer to death, your body loses function in the same way that you never, or in a way that is different from as a child, because as a child you're learning how it functions. As an adult you're learning how it doesn't. So a pretty big difference. Also, it just does not feel good. As a 29 going on 30-year-old man, I can tell you that like the difference that I feel in my body from between 21 and now is pretty substantial, and it is disappointing to say the least. But obviously that's not the most important part. My mental well-being is at an all-time high, so not complaining about age, just so that's clear. Regardless, I think that kind of like journey is being reflected in the same way or in a similar capacity in this novel to where like humanity's reached a pinnacle and now we're going to either like stay there and balance precariously, or we're going to roll down and like start our decline, or we're already in decline. So that I think is going to be a major theme in this novel. And I'm really looking forward to what the rest of the chapters have to offer, especially with the freaking pilgrimage, because I am going crazy not knowing what is happening there. I just want this entire book to be on the pilgrimage. I loved that about the first book. But hopefully this second book is just as good ultimately as the first book was. I have high hopes. It seems to be getting better every time I read it. So that's all I've got for you guys today. Thank you for joining me to discuss these chapters 11 through 15. If you haven't started reading the book yet, highly recommend it. I don't give away everything on these podcasts. It's more of just like this is something that's in this book that you should read, and here's a little bit of philosophic discussion about it. But if you read the books and follow along or listen to the books on audiobook, that's what I'm doing, then it adds a lot, in my opinion. And then, maybe get your friends to do it with you, and then just, do the reading club led by me. There's a little tooting my own horn there. So anyway, leave us a 5-star review, subscribe, leave us a 1-star review if you feel the need to. I'd really prefer you didn't. And then follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. I hope that everyone is staying safe out there. Know that there's been kind of like a record number of cases of COVID. So everybody make sure you're wearing your masks, keep your social distancing, but still go out and have fun. Like stuff's open and it might not be forever, especially if things continue to get worse. So cross your fingers that things do not continue to get worse, because it would really not be great. So that is all I've got for you guys this week. Thank you again for joining me. Have a great week. Stay safe out there.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.